Well, welcome once again to our ongoing monthly series of Security Synopsis. So glad everyone can join us. Today, I'm really pleased to be joined by Andy Scutt from Searchlight Security, who's one of our new partners. As we know, all of these conversations are entirely about being trusted advisor, but I'm going to let Andy talk for 1 minute about Searchlight Security and what they do before we get into today's topic.
Hi, Andy. Thanks very much for having me along today. Okay, Searchlight Security. Well, we provide organizations with relevant and actionable dark web threat intelligence to kind of help them identify and prevent criminal activity. We were founded back in 2017 with a mission to stop criminals acting with impunity on the dark web. And we've been involved in some of the world's largest cybercrime investigations. We've probably got one of the most comprehensive data sets available using a load of proprietary techniques and groundbreaking academic research, it says here. Today, though, we help law enforcement, governments, enterprises, and managed security service providers kind of shine a light on the deep and dark web threats and try to help prevent attacks. That's kind of the mission statement.
Brilliant, thanks very much. I think if I'd thought ahead, we should have called today's session Illuminating the Dark Web. So with no more ado, let's get into that. We all use the phrase the dark web and people talk about it all the time, and I'm sure almost nobody actually knows what it is. So could you talk us a little bit about the origins of the dark web? And I guess if my mother was watching, and I hope she is, she'd be going, if this thing's so bad, why don't we shut it down? So, you know, there are legitimate uses and causes for the dark web. Yep. So over to you, Andy, and let's get into that.
Well, let's do a little bit of clarity about what the dark web is and isn't. I know when I joined this company and I told people what I was going to be doing, what the company does, half the people thought it was made up. It was like a Hollywood thing that the dark web didn't really exist, but it does. If you think about the internet as a whole, about 4% of the internet is what's called the clear web. That's open, searchable stuff, things you can find in Google search. Things like the BBC, iPlayer, open content, websites. About 1 million websites sit on the clear web. So that takes about 4% of the internet. About 95% of it is what we call the deep web, and these are secured sites. Generally speaking, we're talking about businesses' intrawebs, data and databases that they store on the internet. Anything from webmail, online banking, your social media, if it's not set to public. If it's set to private, all of your social media sits within what's called the deep web. And that's about 95%. And then about 1% below that is the dark web. So these are anonymous, closed systems, things like Telegram, like Tor, peer-to-peer conversation sites, hacker forums. There's a lot of stuff in the dark web. So completely unindexed. There's no simple way of getting there. You need a specific application to access that section of the internet. And that's the dark web. And you're correct when you say there are some useful uses for the dark web. And historically, it came from, I think it was the US Naval. Their research labs developed the first parts of the Tor network, which is the most popular part of the dark web. And they used it to initiate conversations or to anonymize and transact open conversations across the internet with, let's call them spies, I think would be the best way of doing it, field sources. With the goal of having, a complete anonymity in their open conversations. It presented a small problem in the fact that if you imagine, let's talk about, let's say you create a building where you have your nice open conversations between your field agents and your spies, and everything happens in that one building. That's great, but all you need to know is that there's a building somewhere with spies that talk in it, and then you just look at the door and go, well, everybody going in and out of that building is a spy. I don't need to know what happens inside the building, but now I've identified it.
So if we called it SpyNet, it'd be a bit of a giveaway, but that was kind of the origins, is where we're coming from.
So they open source the information. They basically move those conversations into a place where there's a lot of public noise and conversation going around. So the Tor network became an open source platform. It's still largely funded by the US government, 92% funded, I think, at the moment through various different channels. But what we're doing now is moving all of those conversations into the middle of a shopping center, basically with a lot of other noise and traffic going on around it. And that noise and traffic is the dark web. Okay, so there's still the same conversations that are happening, but now it's clouded and it's a lot harder to identify. And the goal being, obviously, you can't identify those people that are there. Problem with that, if you offer total anonymity, you're going to get criminal elements looking at that going, this is a wonderful place to work. We can do whatever we want to do with here, act with impunity. And that does happen. I mean, that's one of the downsides of the dark web. The upsides of it are obviously it's a great place for whistleblowers to act, for journalists to work with their sources, for people to be able to report and generate information or gather access to information in regimes where normally their internet access is broken, for people to use the normal internet with anonymity to avoid restrictions on their or monitoring on their activity across the internet. They can use the Tor network for doing that as well. So there are good sides and bad sides. Predominantly, unfortunately, the volume of the traffic in there is nefarious, act as criminal actors, and our role is to try to identify those and try to reduce their impact on everybody's life.
Brilliant, thanks for that. So I guess that answers the question as to why we can't shut it down. But I love the irony that it was originated to help spies, and one of the ironies is loads of people are now having conversations on the dark web which basically can't be spied upon. So it's almost using the tools that were invented for one purpose against the originators of the tools, you know.
Turned out to be very effective at what it was designed to do. So.
And I guess in terms of the design, and if this thing were happening, probably neither you or I would know about it, but is the talk of dark web 2.0 of somebody inventing an even darker web?
Yeah, I mean, there are other. I mean, we focus predominantly around the Tor network because, you know, for traffic volumes, it's by far the most populous. But there are other dark web networks, Freenet, I2P. I can think there are a few that we are looking at, and we, you know, from our point of view, we keep an eye on those emerging dark webs, or those the increased in popularity of those, and actually some of them are starting to become more used. But by far, significantly by far, the Tor network is the go-to choice for dark web. It's the easiest, it's the simplest. The Tor browser is a very effective browser platform to give you access to dark web and the anonymity that comes with the Tor network.
So I guess Tor is the dark web as maybe Google is to indexing the conventional web. For
other search engines are available.
Yeah, clearly, yes. So you mentioned Tor a few times, and I keep on hearing the term onion on the dark web. So could you walk us through the popular taxonomy, I guess, for the dark web?
Yeah, I guess Tor stands for the onion router, and it's a kind of a definition of how the anonymity is built up across the Tor infrastructure. Is the idea that you go through multiple layers of anonymity, so that as you transfer from one layer to another, your source and destination are only known at one point, and you gain that anonymity by the fact you pass through multiple layers of it, like the layers of an onion, I guess, is the easiest way of doing it. And of course, sites, what we would classify as websites in the Tor network, are referred to as onions. So they have a different naming convention, they have a different domain. They'll all end in .onion, and that kind of takes that whole, you know, the idea of layers of anonymity as you go into the Tor network and come back out the other side.
Great. And so you talked about the percentages, just in terms of, you know, I used to build networks for a living, which I suppose is what's got me into this business. But how many nodes? Is it thousands? Is it tens of thousands? How does it compare in terms of the actual internet? And of course, it runs on the back of the actual internet.
Yeah, I mean, it runs on the back of the internet, and that's probably one of the downsides of using the Tor browser if you just want internet anonymity, is that it's much significantly smaller than the internet. It layers over the top, it adds encryption, but it also slows things down. So it's a fairly, you know, relatively speaking, a slow network to work on. But there are thousands of nodes within the network, and that's those layers of nodes is what creates its anonymity. The fact you'll bounce between those nodes in, you know, while you're being transitioned through that to wherever it is you're going, and the fact that user doesn't know where supplier services come from, and actually hardware providers that provide those services don't know that services are running on their platform. So this is where those layers of anonymity come from.
And I guess because of that, would you say, you know, compared to the real internet, you're clearly not going to stream YouTube over the dark web? Does it feel the speed and response of the kind of dial-up internet of 20 years ago, or
it's not? No, it's not. It's not that bad. It's just you would know. I think if you're browsing, you know, if you ran two browsers, a Tor browser and your, you know, Chrome maybe side by side, and you started accessing websites, you'll notice it's slightly slower. I'm not sure I'd want to have this conversation running over the Tor network. Streamed media and video, live conversations like this there'd be delay. We'd probably not be getting the sort of graphics that hopefully everyone is appreciating now, that we wouldn't get that sort of clarity and this sort of level of sound quality.
So talk to me a little bit. I mean, people talk about people selling missiles and all kinds of things on the dark web, but I think, you know, this audience and we're all concerned with cybercrime. So, you know, to lead the witness a little bit, I'm a big believer that these days no one hacker can break into an organization. So people operate as organized gangs, and clearly they're using the dark web and its anonymity as the way of working together. So could you talk me a little bit more through the DNA of a criminal organization and how organizations like yourselves use the dark web to listen into that?
Yeah, so obviously, it works really, really similarly to, you know, the commercial world. If you think about people are into, you know, are in these sort of criminal enterprises for money, basically, let's put it quite clear. It's a commercial transaction, but the realities of how those transactions occur, or what that structure of a cyber threat and a breach works alongside, is it you know, it's mapped quite nicely in some of the attack frameworks that exist. That this idea that there's reconnaissance through to deployment to, you know, exfiltration of data and deployment of ransomware and collection of money in the end. When you look at it, when you break that down, you look at the historic attacks and you start to look at known breaches and where those sources came from, you can start to track the kind of standard operating procedures of the people that are involved in this breach. And it's not one single gang that does everything. So there are specialists that are very good at phishing and spear phishing credentials. They're looking for, you know, user account information, and once they have those, then they put them up for sale on dark web markets, and they're sold to people whose speciality is gaining access to networks, accessing devices, elevating permissions, deploying bots. And their role then is that they'll take those deployed bots and they'll sell them again, their transactions on to the next layer, the next set of people whose job, you know, whose specialist is deployment of ransomware or malware or exfiltration of data for ransom. Those are the, you know, the large gangs that you hear of a lot, sit at the kind of top end of that, but they're not, generally speaking, or, you know, very specifically speaking, not involved in, you know, fishing out your credentials at the start. They just buy this because they're readily available on dark web markets. They're relatively cheap in comparison to what's available. And it comes down to this specialism. It's the same sort of supply chain that you would have in any organization. Is, you know, the people that make wheel bearings are not the same people that make cars. You know, the car manufacturers buy those in because they have specialists that make them at a significantly lower price. And that's kind of those sort of transactions, those sort of indicators and conversations that happen on the dark web is what we use for pre-attack intelligence. That's what we're looking at to try to shine a light on, you know, people that are taking an interest in your organization. And we have a really nice kind of threat chart that looks at, you know, the intent versus the capability versus the opportunity to bring together a threat. So if you hate somebody but you have no ability to affect them, then you're not necessarily a threat to them. But if you have the intent to do it, the malice to go and do it, and you know how to deploy that, and you have the capability of doing it, suddenly you're a credible threat. And we should be taking you seriously, and we should be looking very hard at those actors and trying to identify them before they can action their attacks.
And I guess to unpack that some more, so if I was the Russian mafia and other mafias are clearly available, me doing all of the phishing myself just gives my position away. So actually outsourcing things to various other, as you say, specialist criminal organizations makes sense, and so they're using the dark web to do that. So help me, I've heard some dark web organizations who effectively trade on the dark web, so they buy stolen credentials of criminals, and that's how they gather their intelligence. Clearly that's something that I know you and me and as companies we would never countenance, because that's clearly fueling criminals at the end of the day. But yeah, can you just walk through how people do this stuff on the dark web, and I guess how you, as a typical organization who doesn't do that, how do you go about this secret source? And obviously I appreciate there's some secret source you can't talk about publicly, but what are the general principles? Because personally I wouldn't know where to start on the dark web, and it scares me, and it feels like a dangerous place that it's a dangerous party I don't want to go to, I think is what I'm saying.
Yeah, and I think, you know, there are risks, you know, inherent in just accessing parts of the dark web. Some of it, you know, is or large parts of it are not necessarily designed for the uninitiated. It's hard to navigate. It's, you know, there are no search engines. You can't go to a Google version for the dark web. That's kind of the whole point, that it's non-indexed. But within what we classify as the dark web, you'll find things like dark web markets, hacker forums, you know, forums where people have conversations. There are peer-to-peer encrypted conversation platforms within there. dark web markets are probably, if you think about an eBay for the dark web, if you think about something, there have been a number of dark web markets over the years that have come to become synonymous really with the dark web, and how that they're used to sell pretty much anything. Drugs is a big one, weapons, cyber criminal information, exploitations, users' credentials, compromised devices on customer networks, all the way through to things like sex trafficking, child exploitation, all of those pretty horrific parts of the dark web markets that we're all working really hard to close down. So those are kind of the sources that we're looking at, trying to gain information. How we do that obviously is quite proprietary. Our goal is to be able to give people the visibility of what's coming, whether they're exposed, whether they have someone is discussing them on the dark web. So if you look at things like the Kaseya attack back in 2021, I think it was. That was a fantastic example of a supply chain attack. Kaseya got exploited through their own software. But if you look back in time before that, if you look, and we store a huge amount of historic data on the dark web, you can see conversations and discussions of that exploitation and specific references to Kaseya and their platform being discussed a year in advance of that breach. So it was a well-known exploit that was there. It had been used to deploy ransomware in the past, just very, very quietly. The main supply chain attack that went through and that hit the headlines with Kaseya, though, hit over 1,000 companies with ransomware through that one exploitation. But there was, open conversation. Well, I say open conversation, dark web conversation about that, specifically mentioning that particular business and how it was exposed. So having that, understanding that, being able to look at those sort of conversations, being able to try to bring that pre-attack intelligence to the fore to give you an idea that suddenly you've become the focus of someone's attention. They're starting to look at information for you. Maybe information's been leaked on you. There's start looking at things like doxing sites where people are publishing large collections of intelligence about a particular individual. We had a particular customer of ours, the president of the business, found a doxing site for him through his personal email address that listed out his wife's information, his children, then car registrations that they had, what schools the kids went to, all of this information on a doxing site around the CEO or around the president of that organization, which would be, fundamental information for a social engineering attack or a whaling attack against that particular person. Those are all bits of information that need to be brought to the fore to forearm and forewarn businesses that they're under attack.
I guess the important thing that's come out of that conversation, especially for me, is if we were looking to protect Node4 with you guys, which clearly we do, then my personal email as a high profile person in a company, our CEO's personal email, and actually everything people do in an organization, particularly the high profile people, we would probably have to give to you or to your platform, which for some people probably listening in could be a bit of an icky conversation. But as ever, when you talk to police and people in the security services, it's best to tell them everything to allow them to help you rather than just the things that you're proud of. And I think that's a difficult concept for a lot of people, but I guess a necessary evil, isn't it?
Well, I think it's a horrible cliche, but times change. We're in a situation now where there's a lot of blurring going on, hybrid working and people working from home. COVID changed a lot of things around that. There's a lot of blurring between what's personal internet access and what's business internet access, what are business devices, what are BYOD devices, what are personal devices, what accounts are sat on, and what's accessed off those different devices. So if I think about how I'm talking to you right now, I'm using my work machine to do this over a VPN over my home network, but I also have a home PC here that sits on the same network. I also have, I can access my Office 365, or I can access cloud services from my home machine equally as well as I can from my work machine. So if I'm an attacker and I'm looking at that situation, it's probably a lot easier to gain access to someone's personal account and then try to break that membrane between work and personal than it is to try to get past corporate security. And this blurring of working environments, of hybrid environments, has opened that up to say, okay, that's a lot more common now. So people's personal information is a lot more valuable. It's a lot more of a target for attack. So layering in your personal information or your personal email address and keeping an eye out for that on the dark web and looking for breaches of that are equally as important as monitoring your corporate email.
And frankly, it's the softer side, isn't it? It's the soft underbelly of attack to attack people on their Google or their personal email. And as you rightfully say, COVID has blurred that so much. I think it's interesting, and I want to get into, if you call us up and say we're about to be attacked in 15 days time, or one of our customers about to be attacked, what do we do? But actually it means a lot of people will have to reach into that previously hidden boundary of saying to people, you will have to change your personal email account, you will have to change your Gmail, because that's been the potential cause of a breach, and it blurs some boundaries, which I think is interesting. But I mean, to go in another phrase, this is not kindergarten anymore, this is Kingsman. Other spy films are available, clearly, but we've got to get into blurring those boundaries is actually for the protection of the individual as well as the corporate. But I mean, to dive into that, I think one of the fundamental things I'm taking away from today is somebody who doesn't wake up in the criminal community at 9 o'clock in the morning, pour coffee, yawn, and then decide to go and attack a big company that day. It takes days and weeks of planning to launch the kind of big assault. And by doing that, it sends ripples across the dark web. You pick up those ripples, and as you said, with the cone of hindsight, which I love, the earlier you spot those ripples and are able to qualify them, the sooner you're able to mitigate the damage. But couple of things that come out of that, I guess. One is you call up and say there's a dark web attack going to happen. What do we do? Because actually disconnecting from the internet is probably an unpopular conversation. So what are the classic kind of protection scenarios that your information gives you?
When you look at what information we can present to you, what information you can glean from the dark web, and there are clear results, there are clear actions that we can drive out of that say, okay, we've identified, let's start with something simple, we've identified somebody has spun up a phishing site that looks exactly like your corporate login page with maybe a slight character blurring on the domain name. Right, great. There are takedown services, and actually we give you all the information for a takedown service. You can request the website, that domain be taken down. That's an instant response to it, and we work with, or we're starting to work with a takedown partner to get that effective as fast as possible. So easy, identifiable action, easy result that comes out of that. You can do these things. We can identify username and password combinations you might have. Change password seems very, very simple, but the reality is there. And also renew MFA, 2FA tokens at the same time. And if you're not running MFA or 2FA, then I think you're beyond hope at the moment. I mean, how anybody in any form of responsibility for, IT services allows services open without 2FA or MFA is terrible right now. If I start to see things like I can identify bots deployed on networks, so I'm looking there at, maybe compromised devices up for sale on dark web market, or through our platform you can identify dark web traffic that's coming in and out of your network. Then you've got the opportunity then to remove that particular device from the network, or block that particular traffic that's coming in and out of your network. For the vast majority of people, having dark web traffic or traffic coming from your network going to the dark web is probably not a good sign. Having dark web traffic coming into your network is a nice early warning that somebody's taken an interest in you. Having outbound dark web traffic, on the other hand, is, generally speaking, it's going to be someone who's exfiltrating data. So you've got an insider issue or an insider threat, or command and control traffic is going back to the dark web and you've got a compromised device on your network. Most people don't spin up Tor to go browsing for stuff on Amazon. Fundamentally, if you're seeing that traffic, it's a bad thing. So presenting that information. So when you start to look at what actions you can notify from our platform, you start to look at those actionable results that you can get out of it. You can delete user account or remove passwords, remove devices. You can do takedown services for domains. All of those are pre-indicators and simple ways of preventing much larger breaches down the line.
Which I guess goes back to the position of SOCs and SIEMs, which again is at the more advanced stage. That I guess there's a certain amount that a good SOC is going to spot that traffic going to this mysterious thing called the dark web over in the corner somewhere, and then a certain amount of intelligence from yourself helping us to counter that and deal with that. So at the risk of this turning into film review, I commend everybody to watch things like Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels, because we all know that criminals don't refer to a target as a target. So I guess on the dark web, they aren't going to say we're about to attack Node4 in 57 days time. So how do you crack that code? Are they going to say we're going to attack a mid-tier business based in the Midlands with data centers in Wakefield, or how do they get into that?
Yeah, fundamentally it is. If the idea here is that you're building within the platform is the things that identify you as an organization that make your business. So we talked about C-suite people, senior management, the people that run the business, the key players within that, the people that are trusted to, that if you receive an email from your CEO, you're more likely to action it than you are from someone on the support desk maybe. There are different levels, and that's the reason why senior management are more of a target. But we try to build this attribute to the whole of the business, where we're identifying things that identify that as a business: locations, products, trading names, the things that define that business. So if somebody comes along, and the example you give is, here's a business with a factory in Wakefield. If we've got that and that's part of our description, and we know we're looking for something with this number of users, this sort of locations, then we can identify that and say, yes, okay, there are talking about us. But again, I'm going back to the commercial example here. Is if you've got something up for sale and you want to sell it to somebody, at some point you have to tell them what it is you're selling. Okay, you have to present a product and say, this is our product, this is what I've got. And that's the moment we're looking for, that short period of time where somebody comes on and goes, I've got this exact thing for sale. And at that point they have to tell their buyer, because no one's going to buy anything that's just a woolly description of what I may or might not have. And there are ways
for low value. Again, it goes back to your cone of hindsight or cone of consequences or that kind of thing, doesn't it? That at some point, if they want to get top dollar for it, they have to disclose it. So I guess, like you say, if you're lucky enough to be listening or clever enough to be listening at the point when they've swapped that exchange. But I mean, if it was me, I'd be using postcodes or what 3 words or whatever. But this is why I'm not a criminal, because I'd be
all of those things. For example, let's take social media tags. Let's say your business has a your Twitter handle, for example. If I wanted to talk about attacking you, I wouldn't do it on Twitter, but I might use your Twitter handle to identify you. And if I'm talking about that using your Twitter handle on the dark web, then it's unlikely I'm going to be saying nice complimentary things about what a wonderful business you are. More likely is that I'm using it to discuss or find evidence or information that I want, or I'm planning to do something with that information, because inherently I'm doing it on a dark web forum, which is not the place most people go and have a chat about tea and coffee.
Yeah. So again, it goes back to the classic ITV TV detective drama that just after the second advert break, normally somebody's conveniently forgotten to tell Inspector Morse about something that happens in their personal life that he finds really useful. So we get into this bizarre world of people having to be more disclosive to our preferred detectives on the dark web, of which you could be an example. And that's going to feel a bit icky for people, but it gets back to that we're trying to deal with a big complicated problem here. So you have to do the unusual stuff that, as you said, this isn't about firewalls and AV anymore. This is a wholly different game that we're going to. So I guess talking to that, so when we've worked on the live hack together, not the hacking but the prevention bit, clearly for the avoidance of doubt before anybody sues us, I think I remember you saying to me, we know the name of the ransomware gang and we know their modus operandi. We know what they will typically do next. So talk me through that, and also talk me through what happens when they don't do what's typical. Do criminal gangs realize that moving away from their MO is probably a good way of hiding on the dark web?
So interestingly, when you start looking at the difference between the way we work for law enforcement and the way we work for organizations, if I'm law enforcement, I'm very, very interested in gathering intelligence, evidence, and use stuff I can use in court. And what I really want to do is identify the individual that's perpetrating these particular crimes. For an organization, it's really different. I don't necessarily really care who's doing it. I just want them to stop. I just want them to not do it. So our focus then much more is on identifying the kind of patterns and the way that organizations work. So, for example, this guy that's very, very good at spearphishing credentials, frequently his credentials get bought by this particular ransomware gang, or this particular ransomware gang publishes all their information on the internet, bragging about all the companies they've breached, delivers us a pattern of the sort of businesses that they attack, the geographic or industry verticals that they work within, the size of organization, the size of ransomware they're trying to get out of each attack. Eventually, if you start to put this, big data comes into play here, and we can start to analyze those and go, okay, there are patterns here that says this ransomware gang attacks these sort of people or doesn't attack these sort of people. There are ransomware gangs that don't do supply chain attacks. Very clearly that they've never done that. Or when they have done it, they've listed out all of the supply chain attacks that they've done in one go. You can start to build these patterns if you start to understand what they do, and they're quite braggy about it, and they publish this information. They're happily, publicizing the exfiltrated data because they see that as, the ultimate cost if you're not going to pay their ransom. That's great, but it does give us a lot of information, a lot of intelligence about what they're doing and who they are and how they transact. So having those, you can start to build patterns and say, okay, you're exposed to this, more likely to get hit by this ransomware gang than this one. They have this particular modus of operandum, of attacking you, versus this gang that works in a completely different way. So that's that kind of pattern analysis, the ability to look at all that historic data is really, really important. It's one of the key things that we use to identify how bad the intent is, how much risk you're at.
Brilliant. And I've heard in some cases, I think it was another live case I got involved in fairly recently, where somebody was under attack. Their ransomware hadn't been triggered, but the particular gang put on the dark web to say that they'd done this in the hope that the organization had spotted and then maybe thought to talk to them and pay the ransom. But because this legitimate organization never touched the dark web, never looked at it, and so knew nothing about it. And I think we found a good guy on the dark web who was trying to get hold of them and say this is about to happen, which just struck me as a bizarre, almost comedy of error. So, I mean, why would somebody do that? Is it just the hope that somebody's listening? And it seemed an odd way of doing business as a criminal.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's kind of proof of life thing. If you kidnap somebody, is you at some point you have to say, I've got this person. And it's the same thing we've been talking all the way through, is that at some point, if you want to sell something, if you want to get ransom out of someone, you have to prove you have something. So they'll publish out 5% or 1% of the data that they've exfiltrated or they've encrypted. But there's plenty of stories about lucky escapes that come on. That's quite a good one. I know there was a transport company a few years ago, I think 2017, 2018 or something like that. They had a massive ransomware attack. I think there were thousands of servers encrypted, and it was really painful. Don't get me wrong. I think they published it was like $300 million it cost them to recover from this. But the recovery was only possible because one of their Active Directory services within an office that had a power cut at the time that the ransomware was deployed, and it escaped the encryption. It had the data that they needed. It was a full Active Directory server. It just happened to be offline in a power cut when the attack took place. So when it powered back up, and they realized this, they had a source of information they could use to rebuild their network from. So you do see lucky escapes, but no one wants to count their business continuity planning on luck. It needs, intelligence. It needs, information to lead it.
In this case, which we thought was bizarre, it was the equivalent of, and this is maybe going to create the wrong response, but me kidnapping your wife, but not telling you, but telling everybody else. And I think the hope was that somebody would tell you, and therefore something would happen. But I guess this is one of the mysteries of the dark web, that, well, it sort of proves that unless you're properly connected to dark web in some way by experts, then that scenario will happen. That I guess that the criminals didn't want to disclose their position, and so used the dark web in the hope that the message got through to you. But in their particular case, it didn't.
Yeah, I mean, there are clear examples, and we've got some really cool case studies or interesting case studies around misunderstanding or mistakes that criminal gangs make. Cyber attackers aren't infallible. They're not. They do make mistakes. We've seen a school that was ransomed for, I think, something like $40 million. They asked for a single individual school, and of course the school went, "What are you talking about? There's no way we can pay that. We're not a massive university. We're just a single upper school, I think it was, just a simple school." So that they completely misread who their attack target was. And I suspect in your case probably is they probably thought they had communicated that, so they published that as a kind of shaming.
They just pressed the button on the bomb anyway, thinking that nobody got back to them. Yeah. I think in the case of the school, which I heard about, from what I gather, they actually paid the ransom, but they negotiated. They said, we are just an upper school, and they got away with a much lower sum, which again, I would never know, A, how to negotiate on the dark web, or B, where to find Bitcoin. And if I did, I'd probably send it to the wrong place in a blind panic. So again,
a CTO said to me once, told me once in a chat we were having around ransomware that a negotiation they'd been through. His biggest problem with the fact that they were attacked was not that they'd been attacked, but that in their customer service, the ransomware gang really, really was far better than his own company's customer service team, and that he was bemoaning the fact that he could get all the information he needed, all the things you've just described, directly from the helpline of the ransomware gang, but finds it almost impossible to get help out of his own IT support desk. So that was his big problem with the attack.
Ironically, he got a better net promoter score from the criminals than he did from his own organisation. And he's chosen to hire some people appropriately. I guess one thing that we haven't got into yet, that I was dying to get back to, is this concept of marketplaces. So as you say, if the marketplace is the place you go to, so the equivalent of eBay, other online trading sites are clearly available in the good web. But these things must be quite transient. Do they live for a short amount of time? Because otherwise everybody would just know that's the place to go to,
I
and
mean,
it'd be
yeah.
full of the police every day, I guess.
Well, yeah. I mean, when you look at, I mean, they do, obviously they come and go, but there are some really well known. Silk Road is probably the most famous dark web market. It ran for years. It was the go-to place for pretty much anything you wanted to buy on the dark web. But eventually it got closed down. It gets shut down. There are
by legitimate purposes, or just because people made it.
There was prosecutions. People went to jail for it. I mean, there are takedowns announced on quite regular basis of dark web markets and dark web forums and sites. There was a big one in Germany quite recently. So they do get taken down by law enforcement. Others, people just, I guess, make their money and disappear and decide that enough's enough. That's happened in the last couple of years, where people have just basically folded, announced that they're going to close the market down. And that you get fail scams as well for markets. You've got to understand the dark web is full of nefarious people, and they're not too upset about stabbing each other in the back. So if a dark web market, which works very much like an escrow business, so if you're buying something from a dark web market, you send the money to the market waits for the customer to say they've got the goods, and then forwards the money onto the seller. So as you can imagine, a rather large big pot of Bitcoin builds up in escrow, waiting for these transactions to happen. And eventually you've got to be thinking, someone on the dark web market is looking at it going, if that hits X million, I could just run and take that Bitcoin with me, which is, relatively speaking, untraceable. And they'll fail scam their whole dark web market. That collapses and disappears. But guaranteed, very, very quickly in its place, another couple will pop up, and they appear all the time. So it's very, very difficult and fluid industry to keep an eye on. And to identify all these markets and what they're actually used for.
So it's the equivalent of a guy selling dodgy watches out of a briefcase at the corner of the Old Kent Road, and he can move to another corner as and when he needs to, when he thinks it's time to run.
Yes.
And indeed, as he said, sometimes take the money and not hand over the watch, because it's a much more fluid environment out there in the dark web.
Yeah. If you're not reliant on, your TripAdvisor status or the number of stars you get in your reviews. Although, to be fair, that does exist on the dark web as well. There are review structures, there are trusted traders, the same way you would see on Amazon or.
And have we? This is maybe a crazy question, but have you seen evidence or anything of criminal action? In other words, somebody trying to shut down a competing marketplace just because it's stealing their business, it's on their turf, or is that?
Yeah, I mean, the war in Ukraine is probably a good example of hackers turning on hackers. There's people took sides in that and been successful or not successful, attacking or defending those businesses. The same thing, the same thing inevitably happens on dark web markets as well. But I mean, to be fair, that happens in normal commercial organizations as well. I can go and buy a service that will get me lots and lots of 5 stars on Amazon. Doesn't make my product fantastic. It just means I've spent a lot of money on giving my product away for free, probably just to get 5-star reviews.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. If we apply everything we know of the physical criminal world that we will have learned from watching the TV too much, in my case, it sounds like everything that you could imagine in the physical world has just gone virtual. And so if we get into that mind space, that's not such a bad concept.
Yeah, it's still people behind it, people are people. So.
It's still people being greedy and people cheating other people, which I think is probably a brilliant place to end. So at that point, Andy, as ever, that was illuminating. I think everybody's learned a lot out of today. So thanks so much for your time and your honesty and candor. I appreciate there's limits to how far you can go, but I think you've probably got as close to what you're allowed to say as we can. So thanks for that. And if we can ask everybody to tune in January, because we have a special treat. We have Chris Enser, OBE, Director of NCSE. So Chris is the guy who not only invented Cyber First, which we've talked about on one of our previous webinars, but has also brought Cyber Essentials to all of us. And I know Cyber Essentials is important to many of you on the call, and if it's not, then it should be. But there's also a lot of mistruths, I get, is that it may be the right word around Cyber Essentials. So he will be myth busting, which I find really hard to say. So a unique opportunity to talk a little bit about Cyber Essentials, but really to talk to the man at the top and go for a really good Q&A session. So I encourage everybody to tell the friends and tune in on that. But so thanks for tuning in, everybody, and watching. And again, thanks to Andy and to Searchlight Security for giving us your valuable time.
Thanks very much for the time.